There's a storm across the valley. The clouds are rolling in. The afternoon is heavy on your shoulders. There's a truck out on the 4-lane, a mile or more away. The whining of his wheels just makes it colder.
Welcome to Community Forum. Today is October 17th, 2022. I'm Priscilla Almquist Olson, your host on Community Forum. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome Laurence Cotton, historian, writer, producer, a man of many talents, and who is very passionate about Fredrick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who has made Easton a beautiful place with his creativity and genius. We also have another genius in residence here, and that is one of our two town historians, Ed Hands. So welcome, Laurence. Welcome, Ed.
Pleasure, thank you.
So last night I had the pleasure of, at Queeset House, of listening to your 1.5-hour lecture on Olmsted, and what was so impressive was the many hundreds of places that he designed the landscapes for. I had no idea. I mean, I know about Central Park, I know about Northeastern, but I didn't know much more. And much more is much more. Let me tell you, I have never, ever seen so many places. I mean, you went on and on and on. And his, it was incredible, absolutely incredible. And I wish I had taken notes. However, I don't have to because ECAT filmed it, and you can see it at any time at your convenience by going to eastoncat.org. So tell me, why are you so passionate, and is this some kind of a life's mission for you to let other people discover what you've discovered about Fredrick Law Olmsted?
Thank you for your own enthusiasm and interest in the topic. And boy, did I really go on for an hour and a half. I'm glad I held everyone's attention for most of that time. It de facto, it didn't start this way, but after working on our nationally broadcast PBS film about Olmsted, which premiered in 2014, it has become somewhat of a life mission. Sure, I do have other interests in this universe and in my home region of the Pacific Northwest. Remember, as you well know, I am a native of Massachusetts. I was raised in Eastern Mass, both sides of the family from Boston. Went to college in the Connecticut River Valley in the Amherst area. So I do have strong ties to this particular part of the country, this particular part of New England. Although it wasn't until a year ago that I first had stepped foot in Easton and Northeastern and seen the extraordinary collaborations between H.H. Richardson and Olmsted here in this town. Those in the Olmsted community, nationally, some of them know that I've sort of taken upon myself, even before this bicentennial year. This year, 2022, marks the bicentennial of Fredrick Law Olmsted's 200th anniversary of his 200th birth, which was in 1822. And of course, the birthday is in April, but we've made it, those of us in this arena have made it our mission to take the entire year to celebrate the legacy of Olmsted Sr., but also, as I made a point to say in my program yesterday, the two sons and the Olmsted Brothers firm. So we've taken it upon ourselves, and I'm one of the, actually quite a few now that are out there in the speaking circuit. I'm not the only one, and I'm certainly not what I would label as a genuine Olmsted scholar. I'm a generalist, just like my friend and former classmate, Ken Burns from Hampshire College. Arguably, we started our careers together, although we went very, very different paths. But those of us who work in this arena as independent producers and as public historians, we're generalists who work with the real scholars and the real experts to convey a public message, an interpretive program in whatever medium we're working, writing, film, websites, photography, public speaking, to get the word out. And I de facto have become, therefore, and it's a long-winded answer to your question, I apologize, Johnny Appleseed of getting the word out about this extraordinary Olmsted legacy across North America. And I can't help
Wow.
myself. I just, as you can tell, I am quite passionate about it.
Yes, you are. And welcome home.
Thank you.
And Ed, you are our expert historian in residence here, especially about Olmsted. And I can remember when you gave a tour of the Governor Ames estate, which I believe you called our own Arboretum.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at that time you also described how Olmsted was a major factor in the landscape of the Governor Ames estate.
Well, he was a major factor in that when the future governor was designing his estate, he visited New York and Central Park and picked up some ideas, we believe. But the Governor Ames property is not an Olmsted landscape. You have to go to the next property, the property of Fredrick Ames, and the Gate Lodge, to see a real Olmsted landscape. And given the sad state of most Olmsted landscapes in Easton, it's amazing to walk across that bridge and get into one that's been well maintained. You can notice the difference almost immediately. He was a great landscape designer, although my interest was always piqued as a conservationist by the plantings that he put in at Borderland, at Spring Hill, at Sheep Pasture, and at the Rockery, because as part of our open space plan, we were trying to come up with a plant list of all the plants here in Easton, and his listings for those estates are the oldest lists that we have.
Which property do you find, Ed, is the most expressive and kept to the original plans of Olmsted?
Well, I think the only one is what we would call the Eston Ames estate, the Langwater estate, where the driveway from the Gate Lodge to the main mansion is pure Olmsted. We have a planting plan for it. It follows it pretty well. There was a little bit of a controversy between Olmsted and Richardson over the original design, but every day I walk to the end of the Governor Ames estate and look over at the Gate Lodge across the pond, and it's spectacular. And the bridge to the next property is also an Olmsted bridge. So,
Is it really?
Yes, he's with us every day, and he's with us in many other parts of the town as well. It's just we don't recognize it very well.
For example?
Well, at Sheep Pasture, for instance, Sheep Pasture, the mansion is long gone, and while we all say that Sheep Pasture was designed by Olmsted, actually the area that he did design was relatively small and around the mansion. So with the mansion gone, a lot of the landscaping is gone. For instance, most people don't know this, but the plantings around the mansion were taken out and form a major part of what is called the rhododendron walk today. And those are descendants of the original plants that Olmsted had put in.
I see. Where is that located?
That's if you park in the main parking area, it's the path that goes off to the community garden down there.
Oh, okay. Wonderful. So what are you interested, Laurence, in seeing in Northeastern, since we have so many places that Mr. Olmsted designed?
Well, all I've ever done is driven by the Gate Lodge, of course, and I realize the lodge itself is inaccessible right now, but I sure would love to get a feel for Langwater in some fashion or another, and I've never actually had a chance yet to do that, since that is the principal extant landscape, larger landscape. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but we're very near the train station, H.H. Richardson, and part of which is the headquarters of the Historical Society, but Olmsted also landscaped the immediate grounds there.
Yes, he did.
Right.
And we like to say that the curved driveway, which echoes the curve in the Richardson design, was his biggest contribution there. And it really works, and it really is an example of Olmsted thinking of design rather than specific planting.
And when he did collaborate with his two principal architectural partners, originally in his career, early in his career, Calvert Vaux, and then more later, particularly in evidence here throughout Massachusetts, and a little bit elsewhere in New England, H.H. Richardson. Olmsted also, he learned structural techniques from his architect partners, and he actually built them into many of his parks. So the Emerald Necklace, for instance, all the structures at Franklin Park were Olmsted, bridges, etc., structures. And he learned how to create these largely from working with Calvert Vaux initially, but later on, no doubt, here in Northeastern, influenced by H.H. Richardson. And they were great friends and neighbors, as you know, in South Brookline. And it was H.H. Richardson, by the way, who convinced Olmsted to leave New York and move to Boston, Brookline. Olmsted was very frustrated, exasperated, exhausted in his long, multi-decade work on Central Park and dealing with a political infrastructure, and cronyism and corruption and overly harsh supervision of his literally day-to-day movements and actions. And then he actually was finally let go from that whole experience at Central Park after decades of working on it, and he became very depressed. And he needed an out from New York. And Richardson, whom he already had known, said, you might consider, he had already done his work in Boston, the beginning, the Fenway, the Fens or Fenway at the Muddy River. But it was Richardson said, hey, there's a property near mine in South Brookline. Why don't you consider coming up here? I think you'll find it much more favorable to your life and your future career. Bring your whole family up. And of course, Olmsted did. And Fairstead is still there, and as all you know, and it's now a National Historic Park, everyone. Well worth visiting. National Park Service, and there's the headquarters, the drafting rooms, the archives, and there's no doubt a great deal of material that their documentation of these works right here in Easton, Northeastern.
Yes, absolutely, and the staff is incredibly helpful. We did a long-term study at Sheep Pasture, and there are 40 or 50 pieces that detail step by step, including pictures taken from a hot air balloon of what the overall site looked like before he came along.
Pictures intentionally taken by the Olmsted firm?
Yes.
Really? That's fascinating.
I'm about to embark on doing a presentation on the White City, the 1893 World's Fair, and of course, the easiest work to review is Devil in a White City. So I just am finishing the audiobook, and depression was something that followed Olmsted all his life, partly because he was trying to establish landscape architecture as a legitimate architectural and aesthetic pursuit. And by the time that came along, he was finishing up working at Spring Hill and at Sheep Pasture here simultaneously.
And at Biltmore.
And at Biltmore.
Simultaneously.
Yes, yes. But he gets a beautiful picture at Biltmore. He didn't get anything here.
We have to work on that.
Yes.
Collectively. Find a modern day John Singer Sargent who can do something for you. And we'll have to have you stand in as Fredrick. We'll get you the right garb and everything.
Yeah, go a little more bald and all set. Yep. I do have the limp, so that's good. He had an exciting life beyond landscape architecture, and certainly for students of the Civil War, he played a major role there as well. So he really was a polymath.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sorry you weren't able to attend my program. As those who do know that I emphasize all of that. I like to create a picture. That's the whole first part of my program, is to create a picture of this Renaissance man, absolute Renaissance, self-taught Renaissance man, capturing his Civil War experience, capturing his experience pre-Civil War as he was writing about the South and the institution of slavery for the early iteration of the New York Times. Also his literary career, which is quite significant as a writer, but also as an editor and publisher, briefly. And his contact with some of the seminal writers of our day, really the American literary renaissance of the mid to late 19th century. And I try to capture, and he was a social reformer par excellence. And I try to capture all of that in briefly trying to create a verbal picture of the man and what he represented. All of that leading up to him becoming the master, the creator of the modern day field, if you will, of landscape architecture, certainly here in America, and the master park designer, and of course all the private estates that he worked on across the country as well, he and his sons.
Yeah, and the sons are intriguing as well. I mean, the firm kept in business for almost a generation and a half after his passing, and the last sign-off from the firm on the rockery was only in the 1940s, 1946, I believe. One thing I'm interested in is his early forays into landscaping with Calvert Vaux. And the reason is, if I'm not incorrect, Vaux actually worked with Downing prior to, and we have a mystery house in town where you spoke yesterday.
I understand.
Yes, and whether that, whether Vaux had anything to do with that, because Downing was dead by the time that got underway.
And I only just learned that. Yes, I am staying at the Queeset House. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. I'm actually staying there, and what a lovely place it is to spend a couple of days. And it's gorgeous and it's beautiful, and the gardens are very beautiful. And I understand there's quite a history of successional involvement in the gardens there, which also abut the backside of the Ames Free Library. It is apparently, Queeset House is apparently based on a classic Andrew Jackson Downing design, absolutely. But it was built, I gather, after his death, as you say. And but Downing absolutely was, he really said, you could even, he didn't use the term landscape architecture, but absolutely you could say that he actually was the originator of the field. He did actually, Calvert Vaux did work with Downing. Downing introduced Calvert Vaux and Olmsted. That's how that partnership got going. And unquestionably, Olmsted himself was quite influenced by Downing. Unquestionably, it's pretty well documented. So there is a lineage there. And Queeset House, you could pretty much pick it right out of a collection of model homes pictured by Downing in his several textbooks.
So we have a very busy and talented historian, and I'm so happy that he had a chance to meet you, and I understand that you're going to join him tomorrow for a tour of Easton.
It might be a slightly moist tour, but we'll do our best.
Oh yes, that's right. You said it was going to rain. More rain.
I tell you, I'm from the Pacific Northwest now. I do hail from here, but I've lived in Portland, Oregon for 28 years, and there is a major wildfire about 20 miles from Portland, maybe 25 miles from Portland, Oregon, as we speak, and they are evacuating.
My goodness.
And the air is smoky.
Oh dear.
We haven't had more than about a half an inch of rain since the end of June.
Oh dear.
And our normal dry period has been drier and even more significantly, much hotter than usual. Usually starts raining right about now, mid-October. Everyone's praying for rain. I just checked the weather report. It's going to rain starting on Friday in the Pacific Northwest, and everyone's going to be dancing for joy, including obviously the firefighters and the residents in that area.
Tell me, did drought ever play a role in affecting any of the Olmsted landscapes?
Not that I know of, but I will say this. Olmsted himself, senior and junior, they did work in the West, and they became very aware of very different what we would now deem ecological conditions in the arid West. They became very aware of it. They actually designed and planned their landscapes in the Denver area and the San Francisco Bay Area and Southern California, astutely aware of a very different ecological regime, if you will, year-round in terms of a dry season, a wet season, different soils, different vegetation. And they absolutely were aware of that and incorporated it into their designs and their recommended plantings for all of these sites. They were early ecologists, for lack of a better way to put it. In particular, I will say, I think even the two sons, John Charles Olmsted in the Pacific Northwest where I live, and Fredrick Law Olmsted Jr. in California, were even more profoundly aware, more astute to different environmental conditions, and more focused on native plantings than even the father was. So it was interesting to see that even that education, that understanding improve and enlarge over the generations of the Olmsted family. And if they were alive today, I guarantee you, they would be profoundly dealing with climate change, and with the whole theme of resilience, building resilience into landscape design, and preparing landscapes for climate change in terms of the selection of plantings, and also how the sites would be maintained in terms of irrigation needs and drainage, and all of those, and flooding, and all of those attendant factors. I'll just make one more case. Olmsted was one of our nation's first sanitary engineers. He wouldn't probably have minded him being called that. That's me labeling him that, but I think he would have accepted it. But even more so, he was a specialist in drainage. Boy, was he a water guy. All of them were. They were profoundly alert to watercourses and watersheds, and aware of exactly the flow of water in all of their landscapes, whether they were natural landscapes that they were incorporating or built landscapes, because often they built water features. And they just were profoundly aware of that, and it's extraordinary to see how knowledgeable they were at that point in time, and it's always a part of their landscapes, particularly their big master parks. It's quite extraordinary.
Now, many of the landscapes were done at public places, for example, Central Park, but didn't it start out with a private donation? Or
Central Park itself, the land at Central Park, there were a series of private donations, but basically the city of New York acquired the entire landscape and by eminent domain. And there was some controversial knocking down of pre-existing structures there, where was a dispersed community of largely poor immigrant Germans and Irish and so forth, and unfortunately also an historic African-American community in the center of Central Park called Seneca Village. Now it wasn't, and it's controversial, and there's a lot. Central Park Conservancy has done some wonderful, thoughtful, sensitive interpretation of this on their website, in signage at Central Park, and even in tours conducted by African-American New York tour guides. And there's a wonderful new book called Before Central Park by Sarah Cedar Miller, who has done exhaustive research that shows that Olmsted arrived there at the very end of this time, when there was the final removal, if you will, of a handful of African-American residents that were still there in this place called Seneca Village. But the property owners were paid market value in eminent domain for their properties. They were owners. Churches were relocated, and it was finally a group of tenants paying rent to the city of New York, and those were the ones who were finally asked to leave, if you will. And most of their shelters were demolished in that process. And there is some controversy over this, and it does cast a little bit of a shadow over Mr. Olmsted, but he was there at the very final phase. He wasn't the one who initiated it or conducted this displacement, removal, whatever term you have to utilize, and it is something that we have to face squarely, and we don't know if it presented any value conflicts for him. There's no record of that in any of his diaries or correspondence. Keep in mind, he was a committed abolitionist. He was a committed abolitionist. Harsh, intense, graphic descriptions and criticism of the institution of slavery in his writings for the New York Times, which was reissued in a volume called The Cotton Kingdom, which had worldwide impact.
Yeah, what was the name of that book?
The Cotton Kingdom.
The Cotton Kingdom.
The Cotton Kingdom, and it's still available in print, folks, by Fredrick Law Olmsted. I recommend it. It does have what would be perceived to be dated and politically incorrect language. Keep in mind, he was reporting as a journalist for the Times, and he was trying to capture the dialect and the manner of speech of everyone that he interviewed. Plantation owners, slave masters, enslaved people, and white commoners. And he tried to capture the sound of their dialect of the day, including some language and words that we wouldn't find appropriate to today. But you have to keep it in mind that that's when he wrote it as a journalist in the late 1850s, and that's when he was reporting from the antebellum South. Quite extraordinary moment in his career.
Yes, and how did he go from being a journalist to a landscape architect? What happened that created a change in his career? And can you talk about that a little?
He was already a scientific farmer. He studied scientific farming. He related classes to that at Yale. He audited classes at Yale. He didn't matriculate. He wasn't formally enrolled. And he actually already was doing scientific farming on the Connecticut shore, and then on Staten Island, where he bought a farm and made some considerable improvements called Tussamuck Farm. And he had studied drainage techniques. He had done a walking tour of England to study the parks and gardens and even farming techniques in England. So he was already on the verge of becoming a landscape designer / landscape architect, even while he was simultaneously, he had many social ties to the cultural elite of the day. And those cultural elite and intellectuals, social reformers, writers in New England and New York all were friends and allies of his, and he of theirs. And he was introduced to the right people, which is how his name was put forward as a writer for the New York Times, that he would maybe be a good objective journalist to cover the South, based on his already pre-publication that had already called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, that had already been published to some positive reviews. And at the same time, Andrew Jackson Downing, who we already spoke about, suffered a terrible premature death in a steamboat explosion on the Hudson River. And he would have, I have to tell you, been very likely the anointed, his name had already come forward as the anointed, if you will, builder of Central Park, and presumably designer too. That terrible tragedy opened up a window for both Calvert Vaux and Fredrick Law Olmsted to enter the picture and to collaborate on their winning design. It was a submission, it was a competition. Greensward, that was the winning design for Central Park. So all these things dovetailed together. He was influenced by the Hudson River School, he was influenced by the Transcendentalists, he was influenced by the English picturesque gardening tradition, naturalistic gardening tradition, the writings of John Ruskin, the works of Humphrey Repton and Capability Brown, and absolutely Andrew Jackson in England, and then Andrew Jackson Downing in America. And all of these currents in his brilliant mind, his Renaissance mind, all swirled around and finally ushered forth in that monumental Greensward plan, which he very much co-authored. You can't separate the two really, especially then, and then subsequently for Prospect Park. It was a very key collaboration between Olmsted and Vaux.
And Vaux was an architect.
English-born architect.
Right.
Also a de facto landscape architect, but he was trained as an architect.
What's interesting to me is the fact that there were buildings on the space of that is Central Park. I think most of us looking at that thought, well, it was vacant land, but that's not true. Absolutely not true.
Absolutely not true. And this is extremely well documented in this book, Before Central Park. It's a heavy tome, but it is written by a good friend, Sarah Cedar Miller, and I do recommend people taking a look at it, finding it I hope it's here at the library. I would think it would be. And not only that, it's it was the Lenape Indians. So prehistoric, both prehistoric and present day up until the colonial era, it was also, of course, at least a seasonal place for the Lenape Indians, the landscape that was Central Park. But by the time it came into consideration as a piece of property to be acquired by the city of New York to develop into a park, there were dispersed habitations and what were called shanty towns, and even more descriptively and harshly, bone boiling works and hog farms and so forth. There was a corner near today's Lincoln Center, that far corner of the park, which is where all of these so-called bone boiling works were, and hide tanning areas. It was an area of pretty foul light industry, if you will, in that corner of the park. And I think those were largely Irish and Irish immigrants and German immigrants involved with that. Seneca Village was much further uptown in the 80s, if you will, in terms of the cross streets. But yes, there were people in Central Park, and they, in essence, were all eventually cleared out. It's not that dissimilar from the story of the Native Americans being cleared out of the future Yosemite National Park. And mind you, that clearance already was going on by militia, pioneers, militia, and U.S. Army regulars or irregulars for decades, even prior to Yosemite Park being created. And Olmsted had nothing to do with what was going on in Yosemite Park, except he did propose that it be protected as a natural area.
And he designed many places in Yosemite Park, right?
No, not really.
No?
Not Olmsted Sr., no. But he did Olmsted Sr., when he was, which surprises a lot of people, he was actually the manager of it was formerly John Charles Fremont, but the Mariposa mining estate, gold mine estate in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada near today's Mariposa, California. He was hired because he was such an effective manager. He did have a good business sense, but in particular, he was a really good manager of large groups of workers working toward a common goal. Central Park, one of the largest construction projects to that point in time in American history. The U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War, in essence, the forerunner to the Red Cross, where he managed a lot of workers, but also an army of volunteer nurses and other volunteer personnel throughout big region of where the Civil War battles were being fought, and hospital ships and field hospitals and so forth. He had proven his management skills, and he was hired to run the Mariposa gold mine estate, which unfortunately went bankrupt. He kept joining businesses, which within a year or two of him joining them were usually going under. Happened several times over. Interesting. But while there, he was hired by a California State Commission to write the first report. He served on a body. He was one of several, many, who served on noted leaders who served on a body which considered the protection of Yosemite Valley. It was for the state of California, not the national government. And he wrote the first report proposing the permanent protection of Yosemite Valley as a natural park, not a national park, a natural park. And its wording is precious and beautiful and moving and rather poetic in places. And it is seen by now, at this point in time, the National Park Service as being not only the preamble, if you will, if I can use that in a constitutional sense, to the creation of Yosemite National Park eventually, but also the preamble even to the creation of our entire national park system.
Interesting.
Yeah, but he did.
And can you talk a little bit about his? He was a person who was all about social justice, and in that area, his creations and designs were motivated by a sense that he wanted everyone, the elite and the lowly and just the average person, be able to go out and enjoy nature and to find all of that joy and relaxation and so forth. He was all about the every person, can we say?
He was.
Instead of the every man.
Thank you, every person, absolutely. Although when you read his writings, he's always referring to men, of course, because now he was a patrician and part of the patrician class, and you just have to understand that time period. There was a bit of a noblesse oblige going on. And absolutely, though, he was a Democrat, small d. He was a Republican, large R, a Lincoln Republican, and he knew President Lincoln, by the way. They knew each other. Boy, did he know people. Did he interact with the leaders of the day? But he was a Democrat, small d, absolutely, and in today's terms, I think you would call him a liberal Democrat, perhaps. And absolutely a social reformer. He identified himself as such. As much as he identified himself as being a landscape architect, he preferred that term to landscape designer, he also identified himself as being a social reformer. And his public parks were central to his social reform mission. And that was that these parks should be open, democratic spaces for everyone, regardless of skin color, family origin, religion, economic status or class, if you will, that they should have access to these public parks as places, rightful places to gather together, to intermix, to recreate, to seek communion with one another, to express their own version of democracy, and to seek solitude within nature. As I mentioned yesterday, one of the notions was that the wealthy, in that point in time here in New England, they would go to the White Mountains or maybe the coast of Maine or the Cape and Islands. But in New York, of course, they would all go to the Catskills and the Adirondacks, maybe Niagara Falls. They had wealth, they had transportation, they had the time, not the hard workers of New York. They had no place to go. So he wanted to create a place right in dense urban New York where the average person, no matter their background, could have a mini Catskills or Adirondacks experience right there in this future large park that he was building. And I've heard at least one or two other people, and I kind of like it, because he was influenced by the Transcendentalists. He knew Emerson and Thoreau. That another way of putting it is that Central Park particularly a place like the Ramble, not so much the sheep meadow, but the Ramble, that, or maybe the lake at Prospect Park would fit into this description, that the average person could have their own mini little Walden Pond experience right there in the dense urban setting, because they just didn't have any way to access these beautiful mountain or lake environments at much further distance.
So Olmsted's friend Thoreau was really an influence.
Yeah, although Emerson more so.
In what way?
Olmsted was particularly influenced by by Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on nature.
Oh.
On nature, even more so. I don't have any evidence that Olmsted ever visited Walden Pond, but he did know they did have some interaction, at least correspondence and intellectual interaction, because Olmsted actually edited and published Thoreau briefly in Putnam's Monthly. In Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted edited and published some of the greatest writers of the day for a brief period of time. I don't know if they were also contributing to The Nation, but let me just mention, he also co-founded The Nation magazine, and edited it in its early year of publications. And no doubt some of those same seminal writers were contributing to The Nation at that time, I dare say.
And of course, we all know The Nation is still very vibrant and in business today.
Yeah.
It's quite a liberal establishment. And interesting because a big R Republican was part of its origin.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have one last question. Did Olmsted ever create landscapes for cemeteries?
He sure did. I don't know if he had an influence here. I don't. If you or Ed would tell me if that's the case, but he did work on. He and his sons worked on a number of cemeteries across America. There are several, but to me, the most significant, because it's senior, completely senior, it is the equivalent of the Mount Auburn Cemetery of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a very different looking cemetery, my goodness. But it's the Mountain View Cemetery in the hills above Oakland, California, where many of the notables of early California history are interred to this day, and very beautiful, overlooking downtown, on the hills overlooking downtown Oakland. And if the weather is right and the visibility is good, the bay and that big giant city across the bay, what we call San Francisco.
And the name of this cemetery?
Mountain View Cemetery.
Mountain View.
And by the way, some people think that Mount Auburn is Olmsted. No, it isn't. It predates Olmsted. But there was this, there's a word that's eluding me right now, but a beautiful cemetery movement, and pastoral cemetery movement in America. And no question, Mount Auburn is basically par excellence in Cambridge, the most extraordinary example, with gorgeous landscaping and, of course, amazingly beautiful, mature trees and so forth. And no doubt Olmsted knew Mount Auburn. He surely must have visited there. And he and his sons did work on some other rural cemeteries across America.
So he might have been influenced by the landscape at Mount Auburn.
I dare say he was.
Yeah.
And forgive me, I'm not remembering the name of the individual who designed it, but I dare say he probably was.
Well, he was a fascinated person. He was truly a Renaissance man. And when you think about his managing during the Civil War, managing nurses and probably doctors and other medical personnel, right? And then publishing, and then writing about the South and the slave population, and I mean, you go on and on. It's just amazing because most people have one talent. They might have two, but he had a myriad of talents that are reflected in some ways in the way he designed the landscapes. Can you talk about some of that?
He also took a while to find himself, rather famously. Unless I'm mistaken, he was 36, 37 by the time he started working on Central Park, and by the time he really manifested as a working landscape architect. And the biographers like to mention this, that he struggled for a bit. He did several incarnations and failures. And by the way, he was in debt early on, quite in debt. First of all, he required his father's financial assistance, even at the second farm on Staten Island, Tussimook Farm. He He required his father's financial assistance early on. His father kind of indulged him a little, you might say, John Olmsted of Hartford. By the way, he was born and raised in Hartford, and he's interred in Hartford. That's the Olmsted family gravesite in Old North Cemetery in Hartford, Connecticut. He's a native son of New England. It took him a long time to find himself, and he did probably deal with some depressive episodes early on too. I don't know when they first manifested. I'm guessing in his late 20s, early 30s. There are a couple of biographers that focus a little bit more on the psychology. They probably have drawn a bead on that. But he struggled. He struggled with businesses, with enterprises broadly. He was in debt for a period of time, on and off, and he had some failures. And no doubt that whether that brought on the depressive episodes or they were all conjoined with one another, that's a factor. But he was a great synthesizer. Intellectually, he was a great synthesizer. He read voluminously. He had his own personal library, arts and letters of Europe and British Isles and America, and he was a great, keen observer. Boy, was he a keen observer. Could he ever read the land? And again, influenced by transcendentalist thought, influenced by the painterly techniques and artistic sensibility of the Hudson River School. And another way to put it at Central Park, by the way, is that he wanted to create and I kind of hinted at that, but he wanted to create a four-dimensional Hudson River landscape. And I hope everyone who's watching this will maybe figure out what that fourth dimension is. But what is it? It's time. The Hudson River School painters were working in 2 dimensions, paint on canvas. Olmsted, particularly with Calvert Vaux, if we're looking at the 2 masterwork parks in New York, Central Park in Manhattan, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, which was a competitive city at that time, not one of the boroughs. Olmsted and Vaux, I put it this way, they were painting, drawing, and sculpting the landscapes of America's great cities, not working in 2 or 3 dimensions, obviously 3, but there's a 4th dimension involved, which is time. Very visionary in terms of imagining what these rough, early landscapes would look like, young landscapes, immature landscapes, envisioning exactly what they would look like when they were mature. A minimum, quoting him, paraphrasing him, a minimum of 40 years into the future. But as I often say, and some folks heard me say yesterday, if you read his voluminous writings, and they were voluminous, and they're available in many sources, and if you enter in and walk through and spend time in these masterwork parks, and even in other landscapes, like I dare say the one here on the Ames Estate in Easton, you can tell he was a visionary who not only looked 40 years into the future, but he looked 100 and even 200 years into the future, and that's the brilliance. By the way, the genius of place, of course, is he himself utilized the term, and his biographers have utilized that term. He was sensitive to the genius of place, but he himself was a genius of place. And what a legacy he and his sons have bequeathed to us as a nation. And I'm not here to promote this 2014 film that I originated and served as consulting producer for, working with Larry Hott of Florentine Films Hot Productions as director-producer. But we wanted to capture that genius of place in that film, and I think we did it quite well. And it demonstrates his Renaissance man career and how he evolved over time to actually become this master park builder. And anyone could find it by simply searching on Amazon Prime or pbs.org, or apparently it's on YouTube too. But that's
and the name of the video is?
Fredrick, thank you. And the name of the video, here's the key. That's what I wanted to get to, thank you. Fredrick Law Olmsted Designing America, because unquestionably, in terms of the physical appearance of our city parks, particularly our city parks across America, but also county parks, state parks, national parks, private estates galore, hospitals, particularly mental health hospitals, private colleges, public universities, state universities, Aggie schools, and private schools, prep schools, as we call them here in New England typically. What, from Victoria, BC, to Miami, Florida, from Montreal and Bar Harbor, Maine, to San Diego, from Marquette, Michigan, on Lake Superior to New Orleans, and very nearly every place in between. Pockets, bigger pockets in the Plain States and in the desert Southwest where there isn't that much homestead. But wow, what an imprint, what a footprint on the landscape, and it's protected too. Most of these are historic landscapes, cultural landscapes that are protected with historic preservation clauses and conservation protection, and of course they're parks anyway. What a fantastic legacy that the Olmsted's father and sons have bequeathed to us as a nation. And that was the whole idea. I'm rambling on, I apologize, but that's the whole idea behind Olmsted 200, and this whole bicentennial year is for all of us involved with it, public speakers like me, a couple of us filmmakers, and the landscape designers, and the extraordinary scholarship that's been attendant to this, very contemporary and fresh, reevaluating Olmsted for the 21st century. And lastly, I'm gonna, maybe not last, but I want to mention this. In our film, the historian Sarah Cedar Miller does refer to Central Park as being the most significant piece of American art in the 19th century. She hints at something else, which perhaps one of the greatest landscape architects of our day, Laurie Olin of Olin Studios in Philadelphia, who is also a real Olmsted scholar in his own right, in the pages of the Wall Street Journal 1 week ago, he made a loud and very clear and almost unarguable case to say that Central Park is the most outstanding, important piece of American art, no questions, in the history of the United States.
Wow. Well, we want to thank you, Laurence Cotton, for bringing the legacy of Olmsted to all of us here in Easton. Your lecture last night can be seen on ECAT. We encourage people to take a look and be overwhelmed with the magnitude and extent of his contributions, which you have just outlined in America. And those of us who want to read more, I certainly advise you to Google Fredrick Law Olmsted. Maybe go on Amazon and find the extent of the writings, not only by Olmsted himself, but about those who have described his genius and his contributions. So thank you very much, Laurence Cotton, for coming today and for lecturing last night, and to our listening audience and viewing audience. Please take care until next time. This is Priscilla Almquist Olson bidding you farewell, and may you join us next time for another interesting and fascinating interview. And that has certainly been the case today. Thank you, Laurence.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to spend time here in this lovely community, and to appreciate its extraordinary heritage with H.H. Richardson and Fredrick Law Olmsted collaborating together so creatively and prodigiously.
Thank you, Laurence. Thank you, those of you who are viewing this at home.